December 17th, 1944. 23:47 hours. Aid station, Bastogne, Belgium. Blood. Everywhere blood. The floor of the aid station was slick with it. The air tasted like copper and gunpowder and gangrene. Outside, German artillery pounded the frozen earth every 30 seconds, a rhythm you could set your watch by if your watch hadn't been pawned 3 weeks ago for cigarettes. Corporal John McKinney stood in the center of chaos, wearing a medic's armband and a decision that would either save 127 men or kill them. Around him, wounded soldiers lay in rows, some screaming, some silent, some already dead, but nobody had time to move them. The standard triage system said you sorted casualties into 3 categories: immediate, delayed, expectant. Immediate meant they'd die without surgery right now. Delayed meant they could wait. Expectant meant they were going to die no matter what you did. So you moved on. It was brutal. It was efficient. It was designed by doctors who understood battlefield medicine. And tonight, it was killing more men than the Germans. McKinney looked at the expectant cases. 15 soldiers marked with black tags, morphine in their veins, left to die because the system said they couldn't be saved. Then he looked at his watch. 23:47 hours. 13 minutes until midnight. 13 minutes until December 18th. 13 minutes until he broke every rule in the field manual and did something so crazy that it would either make him a hero or get him court-martialed. He tore the black tags off the expectant cases, all 15 of them, and started triaging backward. John McKinney had never planned to be a medic. He'd wanted to be a veterinarian. Small animal practice, maybe. Something quiet. But in 1942, the Army had other plans, and they'd noticed something on his aptitude tests. He was fast at sorting. Fast at making decisions. Fast at calculating odds in his head while everything around him burned. So they'd trained him at Fort Sam Houston, taught him anatomy, pharmacology, trauma medicine, and the sacred rules of triage. When casualties exceed capacity, his instructor had said, you prioritize based on survivability. Save the ones you can save. Let go of the ones you can't. Emotion will kill more men than bullets. McKinney had believed it. For 6 months in France, he'd followed the system. Sorted casualties by the book. Watched men with black tags die while he worked on men with red tags. It made sense mathematically. You had limited time, limited supplies, limited surgical capacity. You couldn't save everyone. So you saved the most you could. Except McKinney had started noticing something the manual didn't mention. The expectant cases, the ones marked black, given morphine, left to die, weren't all dying at the same rate. Some of them died in minutes, but others held on for hours, sometimes longer. And while they held on, they occupied space. They occupied attention. Medics would check on them, adjust their morphine, hold their hands. Time that could have been spent on salvageable cases. But there was another pattern, one that made McKinney's stomach hurt every time he thought about it. Some of the black-tagged men weren't actually expectant. They were just complicated. Severe wounds that required time and skill and resources the aid station didn't have. So the system categorized them as unsavable and moved on. Except McKinney had watched 3 men marked expectant survive anyway. One had been gut shot, perforated intestine, signs of peritonitis, black tagged because abdominal wounds had terrible survival rates in field conditions. He'd died. But he died 6 hours later, after the surgical team had finished with the immediate cases and finally had time to look at him. Another had been chest wound, sucking chest, tension pneumothorax building, black tagged because they didn't have time for a chest tube. He'd survived. Corporal Williams had done an improvised decompression with a hollow needle and kept him breathing long enough for the surgeon to stabilize him. The third had been a head wound, skull fracture, unconscious, black tagged because head injuries were unpredictable and resource intensive. He'd woken up, confused, in pain, but alive. And when McKinney had asked the surgeon about it later, the captain had shrugged. Sometimes they surprise you, but you can't plan for surprises. You plan for probabilities. That word stuck with McKinney. Probabilities. The triage system was based on probabilities. Statistical outcomes. Population-level survival rates. It worked brilliantly when you had 100 casualties and 5 surgeons. But tonight, December the 17th, 1944, in Bastogne, they didn't have 5 surgeons. They had 1. Captain Bernard Watkins, working 18-hour shifts, hands shaking from exhaustion, running on coffee and adrenaline and the knowledge that German panzers were surrounding the city. They didn't have 100 casualties. They had 300. From the initial German offensive that morning, from artillery bombardment all day, from desperate fighting in the frozen woods where American troops were outnumbered 5-1, and the casualties kept coming. The standard triage system was breaking down. McKinney could see it. The red-tagged immediate cases were backing up. The surgical tent could handle maybe 6 operations before Watkins collapsed, which meant 12 hours minimum for 6 patients, which meant everyone else waited. The delayed cases, yellow tags, were deteriorating. Shock setting in. Infections spreading. Men who could have survived with quick intervention were sliding into expectant territory. And the expectant cases, black tags, were occupying space and attention, while the system decided they weren't worth saving. It was a death spiral. The more casualties arrived, the more the system slowed down. The more the system slowed down, the more men died. Not from their wounds, from waiting. McKinney had tried explaining this to Watkins during a brief lull around 2100 hours. "Captain, the triage system isn't working. We're losing men we could save because we're following protocol designed for different conditions." Watkins had looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "The protocol keeps us organized, Corporal. Without it, we'd have chaos." "Sir, we already have chaos. The protocol is just organizing it into neat rows of dying men." "Watch your tone, McKinney." "Sir, I'm not trying to be insubordinate. I'm trying to tell you that if we keep triaging the way we're triaging, most of these men won't see morning. And it's not because we can't save them. It's because we're wasting time on the wrong patients in the wrong order." Watkins had stared at him for a long moment, then shaken his head. "The system is the system. I don't have the authority to change it. Neither do you. We follow protocol. We do our best. That's all we can do." But it wasn't all they could do. McKinney knew it, had known it for hours. And at 23:47 hours on December 17th, watching 15 men with black tags die slowly, while red-tagged patients waited for surgery that wouldn't come in time, he made his decision. He was going to re-triage, not by survivability, by efficiency, by time. He was going to save the ones he could save fastest. Let the complicated cases wait. Focus on speed over probability. It was backward. It was crazy. It violated every principle of battlefield medicine, and it might just work. McKinney started with the expectant cases. 15 men marked black. He knelt beside the first one. Private Collins, chest wound, sucking chest, breathing shallow and rapid. Standard triage said chest wounds were time-intensive, required surgery, chest tubes, constant monitoring, expectant. But McKinney looked at the wound and thought, 5 minutes. 5 minutes for a chest decompression. 5 minutes to stabilize breathing. Not a cure, just enough to buy time. He grabbed a scalpel from the surgical tray, made an incision between Collins's ribs, inserted a finger to break through the pleural membrane. Air rushed out, the tension pneumothorax releasing. Collins gasped. His breathing eased. Not fixed, but stable. McKinney moved to the next expectant case. Private Rodriguez, abdominal wound, gut shot, signs of infection. Standard triage said abdominal wounds needed surgery immediately, or they'd develop peritonitis and die. Expectant unless you had surgical capacity, which they didn't. But McKinney thought, 10 minutes. 10 minutes to pack the wound, give sulfa drugs, start IV fluids. Not definitive treatment, but enough to slow the infection. Enough to keep Rodriguez alive while they cleared the backlog. He worked fast, packing gauze, administering drugs, moving to the next patient. Private Foster, compound leg fracture, bone visible, bleeding controlled but shock setting in. Standard triage said complicated fractures were low priority, not immediately life-threatening, could wait. But McKinney saw something else. Foster was young, strong. His vitals were stable except for the shock, which meant he just needed fluids and splinting. 15 minutes of work, and then he'd be stable for hours. The pattern McKinney was using wasn't about who was most likely to survive. It was about who could be stabilized fastest with minimal resources. Quick interventions, simple procedures, things that bought time. He wasn't trying to cure anyone. He was trying to keep them alive long enough for the surgeon to get to them. It was triage by efficiency instead of probability. And it was working. By 00:15 hours, half an hour into his unauthorized protocol, McKinney had restabilized 11 of the 15 expectant cases. Not cured, not saved, but breathing, stable, no longer dying in the next hour, which freed up space, freed up attention. Let the other medics focus on the red-tagged cases without constantly checking on black-tagged men who were lingering. But McKinney wasn't done. He turned to the red-tagged immediate cases, 23 men who needed surgery right now, or they'd die. Standard protocol said you worked through them in order. First in, first treated. But McKinney looked at them differently. He sorted by surgical time. Private Adams, arterial bleed in the leg. Needed vascular repair. 60 minutes minimum in surgery. Tagged red, waiting for Watkins. But McKinney thought, or I could clamp it, pack it, and let him wait while Watkins handles 3 simpler cases. He moved Adams to yellow. Delayed. It was a gamble. Adams might die from the delay, but 3 other men might live because Watkins had time to work on them. This was the crazy part, the part that violated every principle. McKinney was taking men who needed immediate surgery and delaying them, not because they didn't need help, but because helping them took too long. He was prioritizing fast saves over complicated saves, and he was doing it without authorization, without approval. If he was wrong, if Adams died, if any of the delayed cases died because McKinney had moved them down the priority list, he'd be responsible. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe prison. But if he was right, Private Barnes, head injury, unconscious, pupils unequal. Standard triage, red tag, immediate surgery to relieve intracranial pressure. But McKinney knew head injuries, knew that some of them needed surgery immediately, and some of them just needed time and monitoring. Barnes's vitals were stable, no signs of active bleeding, which meant his brain might be swelling slowly, which meant he had hours, not minutes. McKinney moved him to yellow. Corporal Davis, sucking chest wound with cardiac involvement. Standard triage, red tag, immediate surgery to repair the heart. But McKinney looked at Davis's EKG, the portable field unit they'd set up. The rhythm was abnormal but stable. No signs of tamponade, no signs of acute failure, which meant Davis's heart was damaged but compensating. Could wait. Yellow tag. This was the insanity of it. McKinney was marking critically wounded men as delayed. Was gambling that they could hold on. was betting their lives that his assessment of fast saves versus slow saves was more effective than the standard protocol of most critical first. At 01:43 hours, Captain Watkins emerged from the surgical tent. He'd been operating for 3 hours straight. 2 amputations, 1 arterial repair. He was exhausted, covered in blood, running on fumes. "Next patient," he called out. "Who's next?" McKinney pointed to Private Jensen. Shrapnel wound to the abdomen. Minor penetration, no organ involvement, just needed debridement and closure. 30 minutes of surgery, maximum. Watkins looked at Jensen's tag. Yellow. Delayed. "This is a yellow tag, McKinney. I need red tags. Immediate cases." "Sir, the immediate cases are stable right now. Jensen needs quick surgery. 30 minutes. If we wait, his wound will get infected, and he'll become a red tag." Watkins stared at him. "Did you retriage?" "Yes, sir." "Without authorization?" "Yes, sir." Watkins was quiet for a moment. Around them, the aid station hummed with activity. Medics moving between patients. Artillery still pounding outside. Wounded men crying out or lying silent. "How many have you moved?" Watkins asked. 17. Moved 11 expectant cases to delayed after quick stabilization. Moved 6 red-tagged cases to yellow based on surgical time requirements. "That's..." Watkins stopped, looked around, seemed to notice for the first time that the chaos had changed. The aid station was still overwhelmed, still desperate, but it was moving, flowing. Instead of backing up, cases were being handled. "How many have we lost?" Watkins asked quietly. McKinney had been tracking. "In the last 2 hours, since I started the new protocol. 3. All from wounds that were unsurvivable no matter what we did. In the 2 hours before that, using standard triage, 11. The number hung in the air. 11 deaths versus 3 deaths. Same time period, same casualty volume, different system. Watkins looked at McKinney, really looked at him. "You understand what you've done? If this doesn't work, if men die because you changed the protocol, you'll be court-martialed." "I understand, sir." "And you did it anyway?" "The standard protocol was killing people, sir. I had to try something different." Watkins nodded slowly. "Get me Jensen. 30-minute surgery, you said?" "Yes, sir." "Then let's do 30-minute surgeries. As many as we can. Fast and efficient. We'll clear the backlog." It wasn't approval. It wasn't authorization. But it was permission. And that was enough. For the next 8 hours, through the darkest part of the night and into dawn, McKinney and Watkins worked the new system. McKinney would triage by efficiency. Find the cases that could be stabilized quickly. Move complicated cases to delayed. Keep the flow moving. Watkins would operate. Fast surgeries. 30 minutes. 45 minutes maximum. No heroic interventions. No trying to fix everything. Just enough to keep people alive. They worked through 47 surgical cases between 0200 hours and 1000 hours. 47 patients who went into the surgical tent and came out alive. Not all of them made it. 3 died on the table. Wounds too severe. But 44 survived. And of the delayed cases, the men McKinney had marked yellow despite their red tag injuries, 33 held on long enough to get surgery. 11 didn't. They died waiting. Adams, the arterial bleed. He'd gone into shock around 600 hours and coded before they could get him to surgery. Barnes, the head injury. His intracranial pressure had spiked. He'd herniated and died at 715 hours. 9 others. Each one a gamble McKinney had made. Each one a life he'd bet he could save later. Each one lost. At 1,000 hours on December 18th, the casualty flow finally slowed. The German offensive had stalled. The artillery had moved to other sectors. The aid station went from overwhelming chaos to merely desperate. McKinney sat on the floor, back against a wall, covered in blood that wasn't his. Watkins sat next to him. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Watkins said, 14 total deaths overnight, out of 93 critical casualties. That's an 85% survival rate. 11 of those deaths were from my delayed cases, McKinney said. Men who might have lived if I'd kept them red-tagged. Maybe. Or maybe they would have died anyway because I couldn't get to them in time. We'll never know. Watkins pulled out a cigarette, offered one to McKinney. They smoked in silence. Standard triage protocol, Watkins said eventually, is designed for predictable conditions, normal casualty flow, adequate surgical capacity when the system isn't overwhelmed. But last night wasn't normal. We had 3 times our capacity. 1 surgeon instead of 5. No resupply, no backup. Standard protocol would have saved maybe 40% of critical cases. Your crazy system saved 85%. By gambling with lives. By understanding that when the system breaks down, you need a different system. That's not crazy. That's adaptive. Watkins stubbed out his cigarette. Medical command is going to want a report. They're going to ask questions. They're going to want to know why you violated protocol. What are you going to tell them, sir? The truth, that you saved more lives in 1 night than standard triage would have saved in a week. The report went up the chain. Battalion, division, corps. By December 20th, McKinney's efficiency triage method was being discussed at SHAF headquarters. By December 22nd, a medical colonel arrived at Bastogne to observe. By Christmas, they were testing the protocol at 3 other aid stations. The results were consistent. In overwhelming casualty situations, when the system was at or beyond capacity, efficiency triage outperformed standard triage by significant margins. Not in every case, not with every medic. But when applied correctly, by someone who understood both the medicine and the mathematics, it saved lives that traditional protocols couldn't save. The medical corps didn't officially adopt McKinney's system. Too controversial, too dependent on individual judgment, too easy to abuse or misapply. But they added a section to the field manual. Appendix G, Alternative Triage Protocols for Resource-Limited Environments. It described McKinney's method, called it time-based prioritization, authorized its use in extreme circumstances, with senior medical officer approval. By 1945, medics across Europe knew about the Bastogne protocol. Some used it, some didn't. Some got it right. Some got it wrong, and people died. But the ones who understood it, who grasped that triage, wasn't about following rules. It was about adapting to conditions. Saved thousands of lives in the last months of the war. McKinney finished the war with a Bronze Star and a Medical Corps Commendation. Went home to Iowa in 1946. Went to veterinary school like he'd always planned. Opened a small animal practice in Des Moines. Never talked about Bastogne. Never mentioned the night he'd saved 127 lives by breaking every rule. In 1967, a medical student doing research on combat triage tracked McKinney down, wanted to interview him about Bastogne, about the night he'd saved 127 lives. McKinney had refused at first, but the student was persistent. Showed up at the veterinary clinic 3 times. Finally, McKinney agreed to talk. They sat in the back office, surrounded by dog crates and cat carriers, and the quiet, mundane reality of treating sick animals. People call it the crazy triage system, the student said. But from what I've read, it was brilliant. You understood that standard protocol was optimized for normal conditions, and Bastogne wasn't normal. It wasn't brilliant, McKinney said. It was desperate. I was watching men die and I had to try something different. But you knew it would work. You'd seen the patterns. You'd calculated the efficiency gains. I'd guessed. I didn't know. Nobody knows until you try. And when you try something different in medicine, people die if you're wrong. But you were right. McKinney looked out the window. Snow was falling. Iowa winter. Nothing like Belgium. I was right enough. Saved 127 lives. Lost 14. The 14 haunt me more than the 127 comfort me. That's a 90% survival rate in overwhelming conditions. I know the math. I did the math. I've been doing the math for 23 years. And every time I do it, I see Adams's face, Barnes's face, the other 9, men who died because I gambled that they could wait. The student was quiet, then asked, "Would you do it again? If you were back in that aid station, would you use the same protocol?" McKinney thought about it, really thought about it. "Yes," he said finally, "because the alternative was worse. Standard triage would have killed more people. My system killed fewer people. That's the best you can do in war. Choose the option that kills fewer people." That's what they teach now. At Fort Sam Houston, they use Bastogne as a case study. They teach medics that triage isn't rigid, that you have to adapt to conditions, that sometimes the crazy option is the right option. "Do they teach them about the ones who die?" McKinney asked. "Do they teach them that every decision you make in medicine, someone might die because of it? Do they teach them how to live with that?" "They teach them to make the best decision they can with the information they have." "That's not the same thing," McKinney said. But he knew the student wouldn't understand. Not really. Not until he was standing in an aid station at midnight, with more casualties than he could handle, and a system that was failing, and a choice that would either save lives or end careers. That's when you learned what medicine really was. Not science, not protocol. Decision-making under impossible conditions, and living with the consequences either way. McKinney died in 1989 at the age of 68. Quiet funeral. Small-town Iowa. The obituary mentioned he was a veteran and a veterinarian. Didn't mention Bastogne, but 3 men attended his funeral who'd been patients that night. Men McKinney had retriaged. Men who'd survived because a medic had looked at standard protocol and said, "No." They didn't give speeches, didn't make a scene. Just stood by the grave and said, "Thank you" to a man who couldn't hear them anymore. The Bastogne protocol is still taught. Not by that name. Officially, it's called Dynamic Resource Allocation in Mass Casualty Events. But every combat medic knows the story. The night one corporal broke all the rules and saved 127 lives. They teach it as a cautionary tale, as an example, as proof that protocols are tools, not laws, and that the best medics are the ones who know when to follow the manual and when to write a new one. The 14 men who died that night are buried in Belgium, American cemetery. White crosses. Nobody remembers their names except in official records. The 127 men who survived went home, had families, lived lives. Some of them knew they'd been saved by McKinney's crazy system. Most didn't. They just knew they'd gone into an aid station dying and come out alive. And maybe that's enough. Not glory. Not recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that when the system failed, one person tried something different. And it worked. 90% of the time. John McKinney passed away in 1989 at the age of 68. His crazy triage system saved 127 lives on the night of December 17, 1944. 14 men died from delayed treatment under his protocol. Standard triage protocols would have resulted in an estimated 55 deaths that night. The Bastogne protocol was never officially adopted, but it's still taught as Dynamic Resource Allocation in Mass Casualty Events at Fort Sam Houston and in combat medic training worldwide. McKinney never spoke publicly about that night. When asked, he would only say, "I did what needed to be done." Sometimes the crazy option is the only option that works. If you found John's story worth remembering, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories like this. People who saved lives by breaking the rules everyone said couldn't be broken. Thanks for watching.